There's a conversation happening inside the White House right now that could determine whether the United States enters another major war in the Middle East. And the man at the center of that conversation isn't the Secretary of Defense. It isn't the Secretary of State. It's the Vice President of the United States, JD Vance, a man who, just a few years ago, was one of the most vocal critics of American military involvement overseas. And now, questions are mounting about exactly what he told Donald Trump about the risks of going to war with Iran. The war between Israel and Iran is no longer a distant possibility. It is happening. Missiles have been fired. Proxies have been activated. And Washington is being forced to make decisions that carry consequences the American public hasn't fully been briefed on. Inside the White House, there are debates, real ones. Behind closed doors, voices are disagreeing about how far the United States should go and what the cost of going too far might look like. Stay with this, because by the end, you're going to understand something about JD Vance's role in this administration that most coverage is completely missing. There's a specific tension at the heart of this story that explains not just what's happening with Iran, but what it tells us about the future direction of American foreign policy under Trump's second term. Here's why this matters right now. The United States has spent the last 2 decades learning painful lessons about wars in the Middle East. Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, each time the stated goals were clear. Each time the consequences were far more complicated than anyone in Washington initially admitted. And each time the American people were left asking the same question. Did the people making these decisions fully understand what they were getting into? That question is back. And this time it's being asked about Iran, a country with a much larger military than Iraq. A country with regional alliances that stretch from Lebanon to Yemen to Iraq to Syria. A country that has spent decades preparing for a direct confrontation with Israel and the United States. Whatever happens next in this conflict, the decisions being made in Washington right now will shape American foreign policy for a generation. Now let's talk about what we actually know. JD Vance came into national politics with a very specific worldview. He was skeptical of foreign entanglements. He questioned whether American military power was being used wisely. He wrote and spoke openly about the cost of wars that seemed to serve interests other than ordinary Americans. That was a core part of his appeal. It resonated with a large segment of the Republican base that was tired of endless wars. So when Donald Trump selected him as his running mate and then as vice president, many people assumed Vance would be a moderating voice on foreign policy. A check on the more hawkish voices in the administration. What's happening now is more complicated than that. As the conflict between Israel and Iran has intensified, reporting from multiple outlets has indicated that there are serious internal debates inside the White House about the level and nature of American involvement. The questions being asked are not small ones. Should the United States provide active military support to Israeli operations targeting Iranian facilities? What happens if Iran retaliates in a way that directly involves American assets or personnel in the region? How does Washington respond if the conflict spreads to involve other nations or triggers a wider regional war? And critically, what is the endgame? What does success actually look like, and how do you get there without getting stuck? These are the questions that every serious foreign policy mind in Washington is grappling with. And according to reporting from credible sources tracking White House dynamics, JD Vance has been an active participant in these conversations. Not a passive one, not someone sitting quietly in the corner, an active voice. But here's the part almost nobody is talking about. The nature of what Vance is reportedly saying does not fit neatly into either the hawkish or the dovish camp. It's more specific than that, and more interesting. Sources familiar with the internal discussions suggest that Vance has been focused on a very particular set of risks. Not the risk of doing too little, which is what the hawks in the room tend to emphasize, but the risk of escalation without a defined exit. The risk of being pulled into a conflict that starts with a limited objective and expands in ways that nobody fully controls. If that framing sounds familiar, it should. It's the same argument that critics of the Iraq War made in the early 2000s. The concern isn't necessarily that military action is wrong in every circumstance. The concern is about what happens after the first strike. What happens when the other side responds? What happens when each response triggers another response, and suddenly the original goal has been replaced by the urgent need to manage a crisis that nobody planned for? Vance, based on available reporting, appears to have been raising these questions directly with Trump. The exact content of private conversations between a president and vice president is not something that gets confirmed or denied cleanly. But the pattern of reporting from multiple outlets covering the White House points consistently in the same direction. There is a debate happening. Vance is part of it. And the questions he's raising are the kind that make the more interventionist voices in the room uncomfortable. Now this is where the story takes an unexpected turn, because the hawks in this administration are not weak voices. They're not background players. There are serious people in and around the Trump White House who believe that the moment to decisively degrade Iran's military capabilities is now. That waiting carries its own risks. That Iran getting closer to nuclear capability changes the strategic calculation permanently. And that American credibility in the region and globally depends on being seen as a reliable partner to Israel during a moment of genuine existential threat. That is not an argument made by unreasonable people. It's an argument with real strategic logic behind it. The question is whether the costs and risks attached to that logic have been fully accounted for. And that's exactly the tension that Vance appears to be pressing on, not saying don't act, but asking, have we thought through what comes next? Have we gamed out the scenarios where this goes wrong? Do we have a plan for the morning after the first major American strike when Tehran decides how it's going to respond? This is not a small disagreement about tactics. This is a fundamental disagreement about strategy. And it is happening in real time while missiles are flying and decisions are being made that cannot easily be undone. Let's zoom out for a moment and think about the bigger picture strategically. Iran is not a conventional adversary in the way that the United States has typically thought about military conflict. Its power is not concentrated in a single army or a single capital. It is distributed across a network of allied militias, proxy forces, and political relationships that span multiple countries. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Houthi forces in Yemen, Shia militia networks in Iraq, political allies in Syria. This is what analysts call a strategy of asymmetric deterrence. The idea is that even if Iran itself cannot win a direct military confrontation with the United States or Israel, It can impose costs through these networks that make the price of conflict prohibitively high. That strategy has worked for Iran for decades. It's part of why, despite being under severe economic sanctions and facing a technologically superior adversary in Israel, Iran has continued to project power across the region. If the United States enters this conflict in a serious way, it has to account for all of those dimensions. Not just the Iranian military, the entire network. And that network has demonstrated a willingness to attack American personnel and assets. American soldiers have died in attacks by Iranian-backed militias in recent years. American warships have been targeted. American diplomatic facilities have been threatened. So the question of American involvement in a war with Iran is not an abstract one. It's a question about American lives and American resources at a scale that the public debate hasn't fully caught up with. This is exactly the kind of analysis that Vance's reported questions are pushing toward. If we go in, what are we actually getting into? And what's the theory of how it ends? And what happened next changed the entire calculation. Because as this internal debate has been playing out in Washington, the conflict itself has been evolving in ways that narrow the room for deliberate, careful decision-making. When events are moving quickly on the ground, when allies are asking for commitments, when adversaries are watching to see how America responds, the space for extended strategic debate gets compressed. Decisions that might have taken weeks to fully consider get forced into days. And in that kind of compressed timeline, the loudest voices in the room often win. Not necessarily the wisest ones, just the loudest. This is the dynamic that worries people who have watched American foreign policy decision-making up close. Not that the wrong decision gets made deliberately, but that the pressure of fast-moving events pushes toward action before all the questions have been answered. Before the exit ramp has been clearly identified. Before anyone has fully modeled what the worst-case scenario looks like and whether the country is prepared to manage it. Vance's reported role in raising these questions isn't just interesting as a political story. It's potentially significant in terms of actual policy outcomes. The Vice President of the United States has access that no outside advisor has. He's in the room. He can ask questions that outside voices cannot. He can slow a conversation down in ways that public critics cannot. Whether he's using that access effectively and whether the questions he's raising are actually changing the direction of deliberations is something we cannot know for certain from the outside. But the fact that his name keeps appearing in reporting about these debates suggests that he is not simply going along with whatever the dominant view in the room happens to be. Now let's talk about what this could mean going forward. There are a few different scenarios worth thinking through carefully. The first scenario is that the internal debate results in a calibrated, limited American response. Enough to demonstrate support for Israel. Enough to deter further Iranian escalation, but carefully scoped to avoid the kind of open-ended commitment that Vance and others appear to be warning against. This would be the outcome that the more cautious voices in the debate are pushing for. It requires a level of precision and discipline in how commitments are communicated, both publicly and privately, that is genuinely difficult to maintain in the middle of an active conflict. The second scenario is that escalation dynamics take over, that each Iranian response to American or Israeli action triggers a further American response. That the conflict expands beyond the original scope. That American military assets become directly and seriously engaged. That the United States finds itself in a war with Iran that nobody in Washington publicly said they wanted, but that a series of reactive decisions made it impossible to avoid. This is the scenario that the history of American military involvement in the Middle East suggests is more likely than people want to admit. Not because anyone plans for it, but because that's how escalation works. Each step seems justified by the step before it, and before long, you're somewhere nobody intended to be. The third scenario, and this one gets discussed less, is that the conflict produces a negotiated outcome before it reaches the point of direct American military engagement. That the combination of Israeli military pressure, American diplomatic leverage, and Iranian calculation about the costs of continued escalation produces some kind of deal or ceasefire. This scenario requires Iran to believe that the alternative, meaning full American military involvement, is worse than whatever a negotiated outcome looks like. And it requires the United States to be credible about that threat without actually having to execute it. That's a difficult needle to thread, but it's not impossible. Where Vance fits into this is in how he's reportedly framing the American position internally. If his influence helps shape a posture that is firm enough to be credible as a deterrent, but disciplined enough to avoid accidental escalation, that could actually be the most constructive role he plays in this entire debate. Not as a dove who's trying to avoid any American involvement, but as someone who's ensuring that the decisions being made are being made with clear eyes about the full range of consequences. Here's the bigger picture that this story points to. JD Vance came into this administration carrying a brand. The anti-interventionist, America First voice who was skeptical of the foreign policy establishment and the military-industrial logic that had driven American decision-making for decades. That brand was politically useful. It helped build his base. It differentiated him from the previous generation of Republican foreign policy voices. But being a skeptic of military intervention as a commentator or a senator is a very different thing from being the vice president of the United States in the middle of a real conflict with real consequences. The questions are no longer theoretical. The decisions are no longer hypothetical. What the reporting about Vance's role in these White House debates suggests is that he hasn't abandoned his skeptical instincts. He's still asking the questions that a genuine skeptic of military escalation would ask. But he's asking them from inside the room where the constraints are real and the options are genuinely limited. Whether that translates into influence over actual policy, or whether it's simply a voice that gets noted and then overridden by the dominant momentum of events, is the question that will define a significant part of his vice presidency. For the American public, what matters most is not the internal dynamics of White House debates. What matters is whether the people making decisions about potential American military involvement in a war with Iran are asking the right questions. Are they thinking about the full range of consequences? Are they being honest about what they don't know? Are they stress testing their assumptions? Are they thinking about what comes after the first move and the move after that? The fact that these questions appear to be getting asked, even in a White House that has its share of hawkish voices, is not a small thing. It's actually how good decision-making is supposed to work. The problem is that history gives us plenty of examples where the questions were asked, concerns were raised, and the decision got made anyway. And the country paid for it for years. What JD Vance reportedly told Donald Trump about the risks of war with Iran matters. It matters not because we can know exactly what was said in a private conversation. It matters because it tells us something about what kind of counsel the president is receiving during one of the most consequential foreign policy decisions of this administration. And it matters because the outcome of that decision and the decisions that follow from it will affect not just American foreign policy but American lives and American resources in ways that will be felt for years. The question worth sitting with after everything we've covered here is this: in a White House that has real hawks and real skeptics on a decision that carries real risks either way, whose voice is actually carrying the most weight? We don't fully know the answer to that yet, but the fact that we're asking the question is itself important, because it means the debate is real, the stakes are real, and the outcome is not yet determined. Watch what happens in the next few weeks. Pay attention to the specific language American officials use about Iranian capabilities and American commitments. Pay attention to whether the United States posture stays limited or starts to expand. And pay attention to whether JD Vance in his public statements starts to shift in either direction. Because in politics, the gap between what someone says in private and what they're willing to say in public is often the most revealing signal of all. If this kind of analysis is useful to you, the best thing you can do is subscribe. This channel covers American politics and foreign policy the way it should be covered. Without the noise, without the tribalism, without the cable news drama. Just clear, fact-based analysis that helps you actually understand what's happening and why it matters. Leave a comment with one question you have about Iran, the White House debates, or where American foreign policy is heading. Seriously, read the comments on these videos, and they are some of the best conversations happening anywhere online right now. And if you know someone who follows politics closely and is trying to make sense of what's happening with Iran, send them this video. Because the more people who are thinking clearly about these issues, the better the national conversation gets. And that's something worth contributing to.